prepare your stuff beforehand, because once you open
that's
it,
that's what I've done with this one.
Once you
I
prepare
had
it,
all my notes and everything.
you're good. You'll be good. All right. So we probably won't use all of our time tonight. Finish a little early. I know you hate that. You know, all of our good times together. But we're going to talk about. We're going to go a little bit over the rise of Israel. So kind of some of the things that we talked about in the video or the videos, but kind of how that ties into the rise of Islamic extremism. So we're not going to go strictly over the history of the creation of the Israel, the state of Israel, but how the politics of the Middle East kind of became what they are today. And then this will lead into, in the coming weeks, we're going to talk about the Arab Spring and then current Middle East. So again, Israel is the topic we'll start with. After World War II, there was the establishment of the Jewish state. It was announced at the UN. It was accepted as a vote. So it's vote in the new United Nations, which was, again, it was modeled after the League of Nations, which failed after World War I. So this was another attempt at a unified world, not government, but world body to try to keep us from getting into a World War III. Okay, so the UN really has zero authority, okay, but it has authority in numbers. So if you can get everybody to agree on something, then you can kind of get something done. One of the few and great things that they have been able to do in its short, in the span of history time, is the establishment of the Jewish state of Israel. So the Palestinian state was never established. Okay. Now, again, we talked about this in the agreements after World War I. There were a lot of things promised to the locals, and none of it panned out. Only part that panned out for the Arabs, you can say, is the Saudi state, which was the House of Saudi was given the Arabian Peninsula. But why did that work out? Because nobody cared about the center of the Saudi or the Arabian Peninsula. They said, you can have that piece of desert. And realize there was a gazillion dollars worth of oil under that sand. If they had known that, they wouldn't have given it to them. But the Palestinian state was never established. Arab countries attack Israel, and Israel wins, but Egypt gets Gaza, the Gaza Strip, and Jordan gets the West Bank. So immediately there's this conflict between Israel and the Arab nations around it. So Europe, in a sense, creates Israel, and then immediately the Arabs locally attack, and there are some losses. At the same time, Israel wins the war, and it kind of establishes a foothold. And then from that point on, Israel's going to kick some butt and take some names for a while. So the War of 1956. Abdel Nasser nationalizes the Suez Canal. Suez Canal built by the Europeans, controlled by the Europeans. Okay, so he says, you know what, we're going to take over the Suez Canal, and abandons the U.S. and the British abandon the Aswan Dam project, and so Egypt starts to feel its wares. It starts to grow and starts to feel like, you know what, we need to kind of flex our muscles. So he starts to fund the Fedayeen. Okay? Think of the Fedayeen as the original version of Al-Qaeda. You know Al-Qaeda, that's been in your time frame. Well, the Fedayeen, and then we'll talk about later in the 80s, you had the Mujahideen. All of these are extremists. They are Islamic terrorist groups that, well, there's no other way to put this. They're Islamic extremist groups that do the dirty work of non-extremist Islamic governments. Okay, so it's not popular for Egypt to come out and try to attack Israel directly, but we'll fund this little group over here that will do our dirty work for us. Okay, that is not a purely Islamic thing to do. the United States government has funded plenty of bad guys to do bad things in the interest of our country. So it's the idea of, I don't want to get my hands dirty, so I'll let somebody else get their hands dirty. Well, the Fedayeen is kind of the beginning of this for Islamic extremists. Israel, France, Britain attack Egypt over control of the Suez Canal. So at this point in time, the Europeans are engaged, and they're not happy with Egypt for trying to nationalize, meaning take over under the government, and the U.S. and the Soviets push for a ceasefire. Again, this is kind of right at the beginning of the Cold War. Okay, what other war happened in the 1950s? Do I know? Big one. It's the last one we won outright. Korean War, exactly, because we did not win Vietnam. So the Korean War was the last one that we won, and that one kind of predates the real Cold War, where it's like communism pushing on democracy, the Soviet Union and the United States. So this is that kind of, I guess you would call it the middle school, awkward time before the grown-up Cold War, okay? Once you get to the 60s, it is pure Cold War. So the United States and the Soviets, who have just come out of World War II, they don't want to get into a big battle again, anywhere in the world, so they really push for a ceasefire. Israel is very effective at destroying the infrastructure of the Sinai Peninsula. That's what PEN is, the peninsula. No peace was reached between Egypt and Israel. So there's kind of a ceasefire, but not a peace. There's not like borders drawn up and anything that is set in stone of, okay, we don't need to fight anymore because here's the clear winner and the clear loser. Okay? So you go from that war to the War of 1967. Okay, this is known as the Six-Day War. You probably saw this in the video, so you have some back history on this. This time, instead of the Arabs attacking first, the Israelis attack first. They see it coming and they say, we're going to attack first. They soundly defeat the Egyptians, the Syrians, and the Jordanians, which is a shock. Why?
Because they were so small at the time, and then...
Absolutely. Anything else? It's 3 against 1. Yeah. I mean, you would think in all of these instances that the Arabs, if they could just get on the same page, would just push Israel into the sea. That is a theme that has come out of the Arab countries in this region for many, many years, for 40 plus years, that we just drive them into the sea. It's not as easy as it looks. Now, who supports Israel? The United States. So we give them the best weapons and the best support. So it's not like it's just because Israel's so good at it. It's because they have been focused on the objective and they have the right tools and the means to carry it out. But again, they soundly defeat the Egyptians, the Syrians, and the Jordanians. They claim the Golan Heights, the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, and the Sinai Peninsula. They almost double their territory. They go from being this little strip of land to a fairly significant footprint in the Middle East. It left Egypt very angry over the loss of the Sinai Peninsula, which leads to another war in 1973. So this is the Sinai Peninsula has been part of Egypt going back to the time of the pharaohs. So this is a piece of land that when they lost that to Israel, it was never going to be okay for them to have lost that for good. It's going to be something it's kind of like Alsace and Lorraine to the French and the Germans. It's a piece of land that just keeps getting the two in trouble because they both really want that piece of land. The territories of Gaza and the West Bank are no longer claimed by Jordan or Egypt. Today, you still have Gaza and the West Bank. They are pseudo-independent Palestinian states, but they are still controlled by Israel. Okay? There's not a Palestinian state. Now, there's a Palestinian Authority. There's a government that runs Palestine or the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. But at any point in time, the Israelis can roll in with their tanks and take over and do what they will. Okay? So it is not an independent state yet. Okay? So at this point in time, it's all Israel. Israel is 2-0. They've won every time. So So then you have the War of 1973. It is known as the Yom Kippur War. It's called the Yom Kippur War because it occurred on Yom Kippur. It also occurred during the month of Ramadan, which does not always coincide, but that is the most holy month in Islam and the most holiest day in Judaism. And so at this time, I guess the Arab nations thought this is when God will be on our side, Allah will be on our side, and we're going to attack Israel and we're going to wipe them out. Okay? This is the first war where the Cold War really has an effect. This almost took the United States and the Soviet Union to war directly. Because, think of it this way. Have you ever had, how many of you got little brothers? None of you? Okay. I guess this only happened to me. I had older brothers, okay? But I'm a twin. So, one year, one of my older brothers thought it was a good idea to buy my twin and I a set of boxing gloves. Yeah, you can see how this is going to play out. So, he gets us these boxing gloves, we put them on, and so we start to box each other. Now, we're the same size, we're the same age, and literally during this boxing match, whoever's getting the upper hand, the other brother then goes over to, other older brother goes to the one that is losing and says, "Are you going to take that? You're going to let him beat you up like that?" And of course, one of us would get upset and get mad and start coming at the other one just viciously like a pack of spider monkeys. Just, I'm going to kick you, scissor kick you in the head kind of thing. Just go at it. So then they go to the other one and say, "Hey, you're going to take that from your brother?" And so we literally fought our way out of the gloves, tore the interior of the hands out to where you couldn't even wear them anymore. Okay? All that to say, that's kind of what the Cold War was like between the Arabs and the Israelis in this one. Okay? You had the U.S. backing Israel, just pumping money and pumping munitions and giving them stuff. And they can't do anything to attack the Soviet Union directly. But it's like, we need to win this for the USA, for capitalism, for democracy, okay? And you're going to take that and send Israel back in there to fight. And then, of course, the USSR would then get the Arab states and give them what they needed and say, "Are you going to take that from those Israelis? I mean, come on. I mean, isn't Allah on your side? Go get them, kind of thing." And so it kind of goes back and forth. But it gets to the point where it goes back and forth enough that, you start to have thoughts on either side. Well, should we just push the little guy out of the way and attack directly? Okay. Luckily, it doesn't come to that point, but it is a very Cold War influenced conflict. Tensions get very, very, very high. Egypt and Syria attack Israel and make territorial gains in the beginning. Okay, but Israel soon fights back and pushes into Egypt and into Syria. So in every instance, Israel has won militarily. Okay. But this one is a little different than the previous two wars. It leads to the Camp David Accords, and so Israel is willing to make some concessions to get recognized by an Arab state. Up until 1973, no Arab state would say, "There's an Israel." They would say, "That is Palestine. That is territory taken away from the Palestinians and should be given back to the Palestinians." So even from the inception, during the United Nations vote at the end of the 1940s, you have a situation where no one recognizes them locally in the area. And this is where, in the Camp David Accords, Israel's willing to say, what can we do to get a little respect? What can we do to get a little recognition? And all we need is one. All we need is one state. And it happens. So, Egypt's president, Anwar Sadat, shocked the world when he became the first Arab leader. He became the first Arab leader to actually offer peace to Israel. Okay? He said, "We used to reject you." And he told the Israeli parliament, "Yet today we agree to live with you in permanent peace and justice." Now, he didn't do this just because. Israel was willing to give back the entire Sinai Peninsula, which they had won twice. Okay? So Israel had every right to keep claim to this and say, "Yeah, you can say, we're Israel, we're here, and what of it, and we keep your territory." But they said, "You know what? it's worth giving this back to Egypt if you will just recognize us as a country. Since then, Egypt has never gone back to battle with Israel. Okay, so it was a good deal. This was smart on the Israeli, point of view, to give this away and say it's worth losing this territory because now we take one major player out of the game, and we don't have to worry that they're going to, a couple of years later, fight us again. Remember, up to this point in time, Egypt was involved in every conflict with Israel. 3 wars. And this now, peace permanent. So it was a big deal. Okay? He offers peace. President Carter sets up the meeting. Okay? And the meetings, of course, are called the Camp David Accords. The Israeli Prime Minister mentioned Benin. He comes, and it's in 1978, to sign the peace accords. Okay? A huge day. Actually, this is the highlight of the Carter administration. The Carter administration, in many ways, was a debacle, but some of which was not his fault. Whether you're a Republican or Democrat, hindsight's 2020. If you look back at it, there were some things that were not necessarily within his control. He has been known since his presidency as a great humanitarian and someone who has pushed for peace around the world and pushed for the peace process in Africa and in the Koreas, or not in the Koreas, in the Koreas. So he is someone who is very well respected around the world in international politics, and he gets his big notoriety from the Camp David peace accords. Again, Egypt becomes the first Arab nation to officially recognize Israel's statehood, and Israel agrees to give back this large piece of land in the Sinai Peninsula. Okay, this is a picture of Anwar Sadat and Prime Minister Benin at the Camp David Accords with President Carter. Okay. Unfortunately, and we'll talk about this in a second, it does not play well back home. This is where we start to transition from the Arab-Israeli conflict portion of tonight to Islamic extremism. 2.5 years later, Anwar Sadat is gunned down, and this is the actual picture of him being gunned down by an Islamic extremist who was upset, and his group was upset that they would recognize Israel. Okay? And so at this parade, I think it was a military parade, this gunman opens fire and kills the president of Egypt solely because he is willing to say that Israel is a state. So 2 years later, Anwar Sadat is assassinated by a Muslim. Okay? The new president is Hosni Mubarak. Okay? He kept Sadat's policy and maintained peace with Israel. Palestinians could no longer rely on Egypt in their conflict. So what's interesting about it is even though Anwar Sadat, who was by all means a very good president for Egypt and did a lot of great things, was killed by an Islamic extremist, it did not change the approach of the ruling class in Egypt. And so Hosni Mubarak comes in and he does not change. He does not say, let's attack Israel again. He realizes, listen, we're 0 for 3. We got Sinai Peninsula back. I mean, that Palestinian problem is really a problem for the Palestinians, not for Egyptians. He says, we're good. What are we going to win out of this? Are they going to get any of this land? No, this land here and here at the time, that's where the Palestinians are, not Egyptians. So why should we go to war over a piece of land that we're going to get nothing for? So kind of common sense was, well, we may still fight for them in the UN. We still may fight for them over the airways and kind of in propaganda, but we're not going to war again for the Palestinians. Okay. Now, let me bring all this in. This is Go back. All right. So the Palestinians are a group that has no state. They have never had a state. They are a subset or a subgroup of the Bedouins of the Arabian Peninsula. And the Palestinians continue, even today, to resent Israel's rule over their land. And what they did was they created a group called the PLO, which is the Palestinian Liberation Organization. It is a militant group fighting an armed struggle for the liberation of the Palestinian portion of Israel. And you see, even as young as kids are involved in this conflict of fighting the Israelis for their land. The leader was Yasser Arafat. Okay? He was the leader from 1969 to 2004 when he died. In 1987, the Palestinians began the Intifada. Okay? Intifada, as it says there, is a widespread uprising with acts of civil disobedience, such as attacking Israel soldiers, throwing rocks, boycotts, and demonstrations. Now, that doesn't sound like it's that big a deal, but it also included things like mortar bombings. So in the areas that were controlled by the Palestinian Authority, the West Bank and Gaza, you would have PLO-supported terrorists that would do the bombs that you could drop to a tube mortar and throw into Israel and actually kill people. So that's why they came with the Iron Dome. Iron Dome is a anti-missile, anti-rocket dome. That's why it's called the Iron Dome, and it protects most of Israel. So anytime something is launched into Israel, the Iron Dome will shoot it out of the sky. Okay, so it has brought about a lot of peace and stability in the state of Israel, and that's when they turned from the idea of throwing rockets over to the suicide bomber. Because there's no Iron Dome for the suicide bomber. So I wear it, walk in, boom. Okay? But then, to have a suicide bomber, you have to have someone who is so passionate about the current situation, they're willing to give their own life and blow themselves up. Okay, it's easy to launch a rocket over the wall into Israel. It's very hard to find someone who's willing to blow themselves up. So by 1991, the world is pushing for peace again, and it leads to talks. But again, this is in Israel, basically, if you are of sound mind and body, it is your duty to serve in the military. It's not a choice. Every Israeli man and woman of fighting age has to spend a certain number of years, I believe it's somewhere between 2 and 4 years, in military service in Israel. So you're about to graduate, you guys are in college, whether it's right after college or right after you graduate, there's a certain period of time where you are a part of the Israeli military, period. It's not a choice. And, in the United States, we sign up for it. It's almost like a draft, but it's not a draft. It is part of being a citizen of Israel. You sign up. Okay, so they take their national security very seriously. They're still a very small population, and so that's why every person in the country, even old, okay, has been trained to fight a war. So even if you spend your time, you're done. I can say that a shadow of a doubt, my father-in-law who served in Vietnam probably to this day would do better in war than I would, because I've never had to serve. He probably shoot better than I can. He has certain tactical information being in the army that I never had. Everybody in Israel has been through military training. Okay? So it's something to think about. If every man, woman in the United States had to serve in the military for 2 to 4 years, it might bring a little bit different approach to patriotism and nationalism. Something to think about. Huh?
So there'd probably be more people in shape.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
I can't say that.
You can say it in here, it's all good. Alright, so you have the ongoing violence associated with the Intifada, as well as Palestinian civil disobedience, which led to pressure on Israel as well. So the prime minister at the time was Yitzhak Rabin, and of course the PLO leader was Yasser Arafat. They issue a declaration of principles. Basically, they say, we promise the Palestinians self-rule, okay, or home rule, which was kind of tried in Northern Ireland. And the idea, we're not going to give you the land back and let you go be Irish and be part of Ireland, but we'll let you have your own government. We'll let you have your own body that can make decisions and make laws, and as long as they don't do anything that's outside of what we're okay with, then you can rule yourself. Well, whatever money comes in and whatnot, you can set your own budget. So it's like having a state government inside of a national government, but they don't really have to answer to the national government as long as they don't break any of the national rules. Okay, so it's a little bit of a home rule. This is a political cartoon, and you can see obviously it's talking about this kind of peace accord as they work together. They actually earned a Nobel Peace Prize in 1994 for the end of the Intifada and coming up with this home rule and working together. They don't look very happy working together, obviously. And that's the idea is that, typically you have people shaking hands and it's like they're barely touching pinkies, okay? They really don't want to do this. They both don't like it, but they're kind of pressured into it by the greater world. The world says, you know what, you guys gotta get this together, or it's not going to be pretty for either one of your constituents. So let's see if we can come up with a plan. And they do. In the same manner that Sadat was assassinated in 1981 by a Muslim, extremists in Israel were not very happy with this peace. And so you can see that Yitzhak Rabin was assassinated in 1995. So again, the idea of extremism is not solely a Islamic idea. I know today that many people attribute terrorism to Islam and fundamentalism and extremism to Islam. It's not the case. You have any group can get radicalized to a point if they're unhappy about the current situation. There are Christian extremists. There are obviously Jewish extremists. And so this is the idea that terrorism and fundamentalism knows no one single belief system. It is the radicalization of any belief system that creates fundamental extremists. Okay? So he was killed by a heavily right-winged Jewish extremist, angry that he would give any concessions to the PLO. He said there's no reason we should allow them home rule, and he is assassinated. Okay? Following this assassination, you can see that that Egypt's President Sadat in 1981, the Israeli Prime Minister came and paid his respects, only to be 14 years later murdered and assassinated for the same type of concessions. All right. So in 97, Arafat congratulates the West Bank town of Hebron for returning to Palestinian control over 30 years under Israel. Okay, but the Israel Prime Minister Netanyahu, who is currently the Prime Minister, so this guy has come back. He's been in politics for a while. He is an ultra-conservative. Okay, he gives them Hebron and says, "Okay, you can have Hebron," and then he starts building a settlement right in East Jerusalem. So right in their backyard, and that of course upsets the Palestinians because East Jerusalem is controlled by the Palestinians. Okay, but again, this is the back and forth. The new violence broke out, which was led by right-wing Islamic extremists called Hamas. Currently, the government that controls Palestine is a Hamas Palestinian group, not the PLO. And I'll tell you why. Here was the problem with the PLO. Yasser Arafat, upon his death, which is not up there yet, we'll get to it. Upon his death, it was said that he was one of the richest men in the Middle East, because the money that was coming in from these agreements and the money that was coming into the PLO that were running the Palestinian home rule he was pocketing a lot of it. He was putting it in his own pockets. So when people were upset that these Israelis were starving them and they needed to be their own state, really and truly, if Yasser Arafat had run the Palestinian Authority well and had not pocketed all that money, they might be in a better shape and not might be so unhappy with the Israelis. But they wouldn't admit to that. And instead of throwing him in the bus, they said, well, we don't like him because he's not doing right by us. They elect Hamas, who looks like they're willing to do something about it. So Hamas is a terrorist group. They're on the terror watch list, or have been for years. The the Palestinians vote for them years down the road because they feel like they'll get something done. They were tired of the PLO making these agreements with Israel and never getting statehood. Never finally getting a peace that would give them their own country. Okay? So currently still, to this day, Israel and the Palestinian Authority is Israel's, of course, controlled by the Jews and Israel state, but the Palestinian state is now controlled by Hamas, which is very difficult because Hamas, in their charter and in their bylaws, basically says Israel's not a state. So now trying to bring peace about between Israel and the Palestinians, it was easier under the PLO because the PLO were like, well, as long as we had Palestine, we'd be good. Hamas is saying Israel's not a state. They want it all. Okay? And so there's been a huge push to get Hamas to agree that Israel has a right to be a state. So that's like a non-starter. If Hamas won't say Israel has a right to be a state, how do we go even to the next step? Because you got to say I'm allowed to be here. So it's created this interesting dynamic between the two. So in 1998, a land for peace deal is signed. Netanyahu and Arafat are called for a promise to crack down on terrorism. They redeploy the redeployment of Israeli troops and the transfer of 14.2% of land that would be able to connect the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, so they would be able to get back and forth. So remember, those two pieces of land are on opposite sides of Israel, and that creates a difficulty because you may live on one part but work in another. In 1999, Israel has a new prime minister, Barak, okay, and he releases 200 Palestinian prisoners and began transferring West Bank lands to Palestinian control as part of the 1998 Accords. Okay, but soon after that, in 2000, Ariel Sharon, who's no longer with us, who was ultra-conservative, even further more conservative than Netanyahu, comes back in and says, I'm not interested in playing these games. I'm going to push back, and Barak resigns. Ariel Sharon wins election in 2001. The Bush administration basically says, we're not getting bogged down into this until 9/11. Now, 9/11, they said, we have no room for terrorism, and Hamas are terrorists and things like that. So they kind of get re-engaged, and they support Israel in their efforts. But then they soon and quickly get bogged down into Iraq and Afghanistan. Okay? Despite the new efforts for diplomatic efforts by the U.S. and the UN and Russia, and even the Saudi Crown Prince, violence intensifies with a barrage of suicide bombing. Again, the technology by this time had gotten so good that you could not bomb Israel with rockets, so you have terrorists growing out of this and using people with bombs strapped to them. Once the PLO President Yasser Arafat, under pressure from the U.S., the EU, being that's the European Union, and the UN, and Russia, okay, they created a constitutional reform which included transferring some powers to the newly created post of Prime Minister. Okay, this is a roadmap to peace. So before 2003, Yasser Arafat was the head of the PLO, which was the head of the Palestinian Authority. So there weren't elections outside of the PLO's organization. So it's like saying, well, it would be as if one of the political parties in our country, was the only political party. So you're always going to end up with whoever's at the top of the Republican or the Democratic Party, instead of having multiple parties. Okay? The constitutional reforms came about because Israel kept saying, you got Yasser, we've been dealing with Yasser Arafat since 1969. It's 2003. He's a fat cat who just wants to take money for himself. He's not really helping the peace process. You know what we're going to push forward instead of negotiating with Yasser directly anymore? We want Yasser to agree to constitutional reforms so the Palestinian Authority in Palestine will have a pseudo-government, a real government that we can address and negotiate with. And that's why they draw up a constitution and rules and regulations. So it's not just, well, I'm just the head. And that's what Yasser was. He was just the head. Okay? So, in 2004, Yasser Arafat, the leader who passionately fought for his people and the Palestinians, he dies, which then allows the current prime minister to become the president, which is Mahmoud Abbas. But Mahmoud Abbas was part of Hamas. Okay? So, the geography of Islam. We've talked about kind of the Arab-Israeli conflict. Look at these two and tell me what you see. What can you glean from this chart? What's significant about this chart? These are the number of people in each. What can you tell me about the geography of Islam? Come on, guys, we're college educated, right? Compare the two.
I mean, obviously the non-Middle Eastern has a lot more people.
So, when you think of when you think of Islam, you think Middle East, right? I don't know, it's not rocket science here, guys. Okay?
I thought it was
Is that
more
too
Europe.
simple? Yeah?
Yeah.
Okay. So, when we think of Islam, we think of the Middle East. Right now, when we started this class, you thought turbans, hajis, and Middle East. You think of the Middle East. There are more Muslims outside, more believers of Islam outside of the Middle East than there are in the Middle East. Okay? We don't think of that in terms of Christianity because Christianity spread into Europe and then over to the New World, which is Judeo-Christian and European in nature. So Christianity doesn't have like one country or one region of the world. Okay? It kind of spread with the expansion. But we really associate Islam with these countries because they're part of the classic Middle East. But it is significant to see that there are almost 4 times as many Muslims outside of the Middle East than there are in the Middle East. So they are very much so a geopolitical force. This is significant. This is why terrorism is scary. Because you could say, well, if we could just limit the terror that happens in the Middle East and bring peace to the Middle East, I'm more worried about the 250 million people in Indonesia that might be radicalized. That doesn't mean they're all going to be, but there are more out here to be radicalized than there are here to be radicalized. Okay? And most of the time that's a misnomer. Most people think, well, there's got to be the majority of Islam, of Muslims must live in the Middle East. Not even close. Okay? So when you talk about the ideas and the politics of Islam, this is a flow chart that kind of gives you an idea But there's some very interesting pieces on this flowchart. Okay? So, think of this being the center point, okay, between this side sees Islam as a faith and guiding principles, but not a government per se, or not driven to control beyond one's own personal belief. Okay? That's this side. This is secular in nature. This side is fundamental in nature. So, some things that are interesting here. You have over here these liberals. Okay? Liberal here means non-conservative. Okay? So, they believe in the 5 pillars, but they don't necessarily buy into the head-to-toe outfit for women, because you don't need to see their ankles or they're not dyed-in-the-wool, very conservative. They say you can be a Muslim and dress normal. Okay? So these are areas of the world that it was expanded to, but you also have Turkey here, which is kind of the center. I mean, that's where the Ottoman Empire was. But remember, they broke from the Islamic-backed, non-secular idea because they said we need to be more European, so we need to have a secular government, meaning non-religious. And so Turkey falls in this category. Although, if this were to be updated, I think you would slide Turkey a little further over. What can you see here about Iran? What's interesting about Iran?
The people are on one side, but then the government's on the other.
Absolutely. So do you know they have a day every year in Iran that deals with America? Do you know what it's called?
It's like Hate America Day.
Yes, Death to America Day. Hate America Day. Exactly. It's called Death to America. By law, by rule, you have to chant, come out of your places of living and working and scream Death to America because of 1979. We're going to get into that. Okay? So, but do the people really believe that? No. And I'm a big Rick Steves dork. I love Rick Steves because he goes all the places I want to go. One of the times he went to Iran. And it was interesting because you can't go anywhere in Iran without the government following you. Like, you get assigned somebody. But it was interesting because in some of the interviews he talked to Iranian people, and they didn't have ugly things to say. They like America, and they seem very open to Western ideas. I mean, they're wearing blue jeans and they're nice and shaking his hand and all this kind of stuff. It's interesting that the Iranian people are much more on the liberal side of this spectrum of Islam, but their government is where? They are just about to the side of terrorism. AQ is Al-Qaeda. Okay? They are ultra-conservative. It's a theocracy. Okay? The real control in Iran is the church, not the government. The government asks the church what they're supposed to do. Okay? Again, what about Egypt? People on both sides. Again, I think if you were to update this flowchart, you'd probably put the Egyptian government more here now because you had the Muslim Brotherhood that came to power. Then you had the Arab Spring, and so now they're in conflict. They're waffling, like they're going back and forth here. Okay, the Egyptian people are split. There are some that are devout Muslims, but they don't let their faith impact their daily life in work and school and everything, so they're much more liberal in nature. And then there are some that are devout and very conservative. Okay, so they're very split. The Saudi government, very orthodox. Okay? Now I do want you to know a term. It's not in the PowerPoint, so you need to know this. Okay? It's called Wahhabism. Okay? Wahhabism comes from the marriage of an Al-Salam. It's like Al-Salam man Wahhabi, and it becomes Wahhabism because he came up with the idea that in the 1700s you had to be. He was a man that pushed for reform in Islam back to an older time, a more conservative time. So you got to remember the 1700s. We talked about the Ottoman Empire. By this point in time, Ottoman Empire is starting to wane. It's starting to be influenced by the Europeans greatly. They're starting to dress more like Europeans. The influence is the tide has turned where the Islamic-based Ottoman Empire is waned to the point where it's being greatly influenced by the Europeans. And he came out and said, no, we need to be true to our Bedouin, to our Islamic heritage. And he gets married, in a sense, to this Saudi family before they become the Saudis. Okay, they're the House of Saudi, but they don't have control of Saudi Arabia. But at the end of World War I and the end of World War II, when the Saudi Arabians get Saudi Arabia, the House of Saudi gets Saudi Arabia, they have been entrenched in this Wahhabism now for over 100 years. They're conservative. If you go to Saudi Arabia right now, it's one of the wealthiest countries in the world, in the Middle East, and they have a lot of the creature comforts that we have: indoor plumbing, satellite TV, internet, all this kind of stuff. At the same time, the government controls everything. Okay, they're very conservative. Women have to dress head to toe, covering their bodies, everything. So women have very few rights there, although they're supposed to be protected by their males. So you have probably the most progressive looking country, meaning advanced in its own way, looking like a very developed country with a culture that is extremely conservative. Okay? Out of Wahhabism grows some of the tenements of this fundamental Al-Qaeda-based terroristic ideas. Where is Osama bin Laden from? Nope, that's where he went to hide.
Isn't Saudi Arabia?
He came from Saudi Arabia. He's well connected in Saudi Arabia. He came from a wealthy family in Saudi Arabia. Very much so was entrenched in Wahhabism. Okay, and then when he becomes a terrorist, and the juxtaposition there is that he becomes a terrorist, but who is an ally of Saudi Arabia? No, the United States. We are a huge ally of Saudi. Why? Because they got all the oil. We buy a lot of their oil, right? And so even though this is a non-democratic, this is a kingdomship, okay? These people are handing the government down to their sons, okay? This is a straight non-democracy. But they have been pivotal in our battle against Iraq and terrorism. They have been pivotal in the peace process and being a good steward of American influence. They were on our side of the Cold War. So the Saudi Arabians have been a U.S. ally. At the same time, one of the worst arms of terrorism grew out of their country. Some of the 9/11 bombers were from Saudi Arabia. And so there's a juxtaposition of, we want to be conservative, but conservative doesn't mean terrorist. So if you were to ask the House of Saudi or people in Saudi Arabia who were not extremists, do you believe in what you believe? Yes, and women should be covered up and conservative and all that. They're not fundamentalists. They're not extreme fundamentalists. They don't think that my wife is not a good person because she doesn't dress from head to toe and cover up. That's what a fundamentalist says, or extreme fundamentalist. Anyone who doesn't should be put to death. And I'm going to get a reward for doing it. So as far on the spectrum as the Saudi Arabians are, what's interesting about them is they don't try to project their belief onto others. They say, we believe what we believe in our country, but they're not. Notice they have helped us fight against ISIL and ISIS. Because they say, even though ISIS is trying to say, oh, we need this great Islamic caliphate where it's an Islamic world. And they go, we're not interested in that. We have our beliefs, and we are dedicated to our beliefs. But we don't think you should fight the world, for what you're saying are your beliefs, and your beliefs are corrupted. So that's where they kind of break. Even though they're ultra conservative, they don't go all the way over here. Okay, to orthodoxy is about as far over as you go before you start going off to terrorism, to extreme fundamentalism. Any questions about that? All right, so the rise of extremist Islam. Okay, why the Middle East? All right, so the ideology again. It's you're with us or you're against us idea. It is a way. Again, what's sad is that what made Islam grow so fast. We studied this. It was on the midterm. What was one of the things that Muhammad was able to offer people that made them flock to his faith?
Social mobility.
Exactly. Social mobility. Because he came from a class that was not a higher class. He was able to marry above his station because his wife had money. And his idea allowed for you not to be pigeonholed into one certain class. So today's fundamentalists have taken that idea and worked it. There are people today coming from that 800 million side who are trying to get to the Middle East where ISIS is because of the promise of purpose. Whether it's real or not, it's just this promise of purpose. Wherever they are currently, in the United States or in Europe, they have thought that I don't have a purpose, but I read this stuff and it talks about being part of this great caliphate that's going to grow and be, and so they start to say, I'm worthless, but I want to be part of something bigger than me. And so the idea that I can grow beyond my station gets co-opted into, I want to grow into this organization, and I will do whatever this organization tells me to do, because outside of this I'm nothing. Okay? The whole idea of ISIS and any, not just the ISIS what we're dealing with today, but any fundamental group that allows their own to sacrifice their life for the organization, okay, in a terroristic fashion, is a brainwashing of, by yourself you're nothing, but you're part of something bigger. It's the same thing as gang mentality. Gang mentality is, you got nobody, you grow up somewhere, you're poor, you don't have a job, your family doesn't have a job, maybe single parent home, there's lots of things going bad in your life, but come hang out with us and you could be part of this family, this group. And at the beginning it's great, because I'm like, we're cool and everything, but then I need you to do something for me. Once I need you to do something for me, I'm going to make you do something that's going to maybe make somebody do something, but maybe questionable in the law. Okay? And then from there, I may have you do something worse. It's the same mentality with terrorism and these terror groups. Okay? They co-opt the idea of identity, of who you are, who you want to be, or why you're important, why you're not, to do things that, if you go back to the beginning, they never would have even imagined that they would do. Another reason it's grown out of the Middle East is a lack of democracy. One of the reasons why it has not taken such great hold here in the United States is that we have a fervent understanding of that we have rights, and I don't need to give up my rights to be a part of something I don't want to be a part of. Being able to think for oneself and make your own decision. There were no democracies in the Middle East. That's why the Arab Spring had such a hard time. We're going to talk about that. It was a great thought and a great expression of the growth of democracy, but it has had fits and starts because when you don't have any experience in it, it's hard to maintain. Okay? Because remember, when you go back to pre-democracy, you go back to pre-government, who in this room is probably going to have the most power? That guy. He's the biggest one. He looks pretty big. He looks pretty strong. In a fight, he probably wins. Okay? It's hard to break that mold. Okay? It's hard to break that mold. Then there's a rise of expectations. So once oil is discovered, and once you have self-rule, expectations go up. And as soon as expectations go up and they're not met, people get frustrated. Again, where does revolution come from? It comes from the lack of surplus. Why did the American Revolution happen? It's very simple. You can say, well, no, taxation without representation. Yes, that's true. It's the cute little rhyme that you were taught when you were kids. Okay? And it's true. But the reality is that people started to say, why am I spending my hard-earned tax money to send it back to England, and working hard, it's going back to England, and I'm struggling, it's going back to England. Where was the surplus? It was in England. And because the surplus was in England, the people in the Americas were saying, we have the goods here, and we're sending our surplus over there. That's not fair. There's not enough here. Once we separated from England, we had our own country, we had plenty. And we had a civil war that's a little different. That was over a different idea. But for the most part, it's been a pretty peaceful country because we got plenty. I promise you. If we ran out of what? Whatever. We ran out of the ability to sustain our economy at the high level, our country would struggle. Not because democracy is not a great idea, but because when you don't meet the expectations of the populace, when there's not enough to go around, people get frustrated. And then if they get frustrated enough, it takes a while, because we're civilized people, we're educated. I mean, we're bigger than that. You ever watch The Walking Dead? Things like that, those apocalyptic, type of shows. It always boils down to when the situation goes south, man degrades to its base idea of survival. It doesn't matter that murder is illegal. There are no cops around. You got stuff I needed. I take it from you, okay? So this idea of post-World War I, post-World War II, there's these high expectations, but they're not met, and so they grow frustrated. And this frustration, then there's inequality. Again, you have the haves and the have-nots. And that even gets exacerbated by oil. Have and have-nots. How do you spread that wealth amongst the many? But then you also have growing populations. You have the expanding populace of the Middle East and more have and have-nots. Right? So, explaining the growth of these extremist ideas. There are many factors. There are political factors, okay? And these are all listed. We're not going to go through all these, but just to look at a couple. Political factors. For the most part, most of the governments in the Middle East are authoritarian. What does that mean? I tell you what to do, and you don't ask questions. Sound good? Not so much. Just raising expectations. But why? Start to question. With the growth of the internet, that's where the Arab Spring came from. It's okay to listen to the government when the government's the only people to listen to, and there's no other source of ideas. But with the internet, and again, kind of like the old idea of trade, when ideas start to flow, people start to ask questions. Well, why do I have to listen to you? Oh, because you said so? That's not a good enough answer. Okay? So, authoritarian government. Next is corrupt governments. Governments in the Middle East are highly corrupt, just like they have been elsewhere in the world. And when I think, hey, he works for the government, he seems to live well above his station, I pay my taxes, and I'm still digging it out every day the best I can just to feed my family, you're making money somehow outside of the government pension. I get mad at you for that. There's no brotherhood between us. I mean, I may see you at the mosque on Sunday, but you're making it and I'm not. You're taking advantage. That happens. Okay? Lack of civil rights, democracy. The whole idea of you just don't have your place. Okay? Then you start thinking of pan-Islamic ideas. You start to get this idea, well, we're not the only group of Muslims that live in a country that's poor, that can't find their way, and so you reach out to others. So what connects you is your strife. ISIS is all about the groups that have come together because they don't have jobs, they don't have means, or it's all coming out of their strife. And then you create a hierarchy, and I can get mine, so now I'm motivating others to feel the same way I did to start with, but I'm in charge, so now I'm doing well. Okay? It's a game. Totally a game. Economic factors. Poverty. Small, wealthy elite. You ever seen that commercial, and you may not have because it's been gone for a while now, but there was a commercial that was like it had a Russian on it, and he was like lifting weights, but he wasn't lifting weights. He had like these electrodes that were lifting weights for him, and his muscles were contracting, and he's like petting his pet giraffe. It's like it's stupid wealthy, right? Okay. Well, there are people in the Middle East that are like that. It's called the House of Saudi. And House of Saudi has so much money, like everything in their house is like gold. Okay? Donald Trump looked like a pauper. Okay, in terms of his own wealth, right? But when you have people that have lots of wealth, but there's a very small group, and everybody else is dirt poor. First thing I'm going to say, if I'm an Islamic extremist, I'm going to say, look at those wealthy Muslims. They're not real Muslims. You need to be a part of us. And so that's kind of co-ops the idea. So there are economic factors. There are geopolitical factors. Okay, the rapid wealth creation in the Middle East, but then it's not spread evenly. You have the Iranian Revolution, which we're going to talk about. You have the invasion of the Soviet Union in Afghanistan. What's been the theme of the Middle East since the 1970s? What was the downfall of the Ottoman Empire? The greatest downfall of the Ottoman Empire. What made them fall? You know how to...
Bad leadership.
Well, bad leadership, and what happened in turn with that from the outside? What was the outside influence that really hurt the Ottoman Empire? You wrote any questions? What used to go through the Ottoman Empire? Silk Road. But what changed?
They could go around.
They could go around. And then when they said, well, if you go around, they started cutting what? Taxes. They started cutting deals. Oh, yeah. Right? And giving the Europeans influence. Right? So from about 1700, from the 1700s, from about the 1700s to today, there's been this undercurrent of the Middle East has been taken advantage of by the modern Western world. Okay? And so you have, in 1980, Afghanistan is an Islamic country that's invaded by the Soviet Union. Because they want to show that they're still a world power. You got to remember, 1980s is starting to be the end. I'll be honest, they invaded Afghanistan because they couldn't take us on directly, and they needed to show that they were still relevant. And so they thought, well, you take that backwards country right there. It's just full of mountains. That was a mistake. Okay, it was there in Vietnam. They went in there and thought they could just roll in there and take over. They fought a guerrilla war for 10 years. Granted, we helped the guerrillas. We gave them arms. It's called Taliban. We gave them the arms. Okay? So, geopolitical factors there are a lot of influences in the Middle East from the Cold War area and even before that was a negative influence on the Middle East from a geopolitical realm. Social factors, we talked about changing economy, rapid growth of population, lack of social mobility, lack of education, okay? And recently, technology factors. With the growth of the internet has been the exponential growth of terrorism because they can put their message out on a wider range and infect young people who don't know any better. So you have OPEC. OPEC are oil-producing countries, okay? So this goes back to the Carter administration. In 1973, OPEC was formed, and they started to use oil to force Western governments to stop supporting Israel. You also in Libya have Muammar Gaddafi, who we ended up taking out during the Arab Spring. Didn't work out too well, and now they're still trying to sort through it. He used oil to rebuild his country. And then he also used his oil to become extremely wealthy and do extremely horrible things to his own people. Okay? So you had the revolution in Iran. In the 1950s and 60s, the U.S. put the Shah of Iran into power after World War II, his family. Okay? But there were economic problems. There was a slowdown in the world's economy, and the people of Iran were poor, and they hated the Shah of Iran for his opulence, meaning his wealth. And so devout Muslims hated the Western influence because they saw him as a puppet of the West. So the Shah's police, which is the Safa, they would torture and imprison people who were political dissidents. They would put them in jail and say, you can't speak negatively about the Shah, which is interesting because we have freedom of speech, but the Shah was like, no, you can't do that. Okay? Again, we didn't always back the best people. Okay? So you had the Shah of Iran, which is on the left, turmoil in Iran, and then you have the Ayatollah Khomeini. Ayatollah Khomeini's been dead for a while. Okay? But he's the guy that led Iran out of Western control from the Shah of Iran into the Iranian Revolution. Okay? While we have Death to America Day. Alright, so the Ayatollah Khomeini was a cleric. He was exiled to Paris. But still his message of Islamic revolution spread, unrest spread to, and the Shah left to the United States. He also had cancer at the time. He was probably within 6 months of dying anyway. Okay? But his government fell, and traditional Islamic law was restored. Okay? Which is Sharia law. Okay? Very, very, very strict law. Like when you steal something, cut your hand off. Okay? Kind of thing. They take the Americans hostage at the embassy. Okay? And the conflict in the U.S. is raised, and there's an oil embargo against Iran. So because of it, we said we're not buying any oil, and nobody who is part of our group is going to buy our oil. So that's when we started to embargo their oil. This begins the sanctions of Iran, which are still going on today. And now you hear about President Trump and the deal and the nuclear deal. This all has ties back to this time in the 70s. Okay? It's a picture of Khomeini and the young people that are rising up in the revolution. Okay? Again, beyond there, you have in the 1979, the Soviet Union moved into Afghanistan. Muslim people in Iran helped. So did the United States. Afghan rebels won in 1990. Another civil war broke out and was won by the brutal Taliban. The Taliban and Osama bin Laden and his Al-Qaeda friends are close allies. So we would have never known this in the 1980s, but we were pumping arms into Afghanistan to help the poor Muslims being attacked by the Red Army. They, in turn, 10 years later, used those same weapons against us. Okay? They're still using some of those weapons against us in Afghanistan. Some of the weapons the Taliban had to take control, we gave them. Okay? So we were so worried about the Soviets that we ended up giving them the means of fighting us years later. Then you have Iran versus Iraq. Basically, you have the Shiites versus the Sunnis. Okay? Iran is a Shiite country. Their clerics are Shiite. In Iraq, it's Sunni. Okay? At least until the end of Desert Storm, when we overthrew the government. Okay? And then since then, there's kind of a mix between the Shia and the Sunni, but there was a civil war there for a while. So they argued for years over the Straits of Hormuz, why the waterway. Actually, Iraq does not have a natural waterway out of, but Iran does. So they were fighting over it. Okay? So, going forward, next week we'll talk about... I'll pull it up. Next week... Yeah, the Gulf Wars. So we'll talk about the Gulf Wars and the impact of, we'll start into the modern history of the Middle East. We'll talk about the Gulf Wars, which will then in the next week lead into the Arab Spring. And then your final project your final paper will be along the Arab Spring line. What do you think the future of the Arab-Israeli conflict will be? Maybe the Iranian deal, something to deal with modern Middle East politics. Okay, so start to look at ideas that you may want to cover. Okay, because I may give you some flexibility to choose your own topic. Okay, so I'll give you some examples, but you don't have to necessarily take my example. You can come up with your own. And then we'll have our final. It'll be in the same fashion. It'll be online. I'll give you a week to take it during that finals week. All right? Any questions? All right. See you next week.